First thing we want to do is set up our system defaults before we get started anywhere else. And system defaults are basically specific fields you would like defaulted certain data so you don't have to keep typing it in over and over again. For example, I'm going to come up here and click on the blue dude, and this is where we enter in the patient information, or called the patient demographics. So you can see up at the top we've got the patient name and the zip code. Let's say that 85% of our patients come from the zip code of 84117. Wouldn't it be great if that zip code automatically defaulted to 84117? Well, you can do that by setting up your system defaults. However, it's not permanent. In other words, let's say another patient comes along and they're from 84093. Well, simply delete the default and type in your zip code. So you can always override it. It's just basically helping you cut down on some work. So having said that, let's go and set up our system defaults. We'll close out of the screen and go Utilities to System Defaults. First of all, it's divided into two sections. Over to the left, we have all our categories that we can set up defaults for. And then with each category we click on, over to the right, it'll have the details. So first of all is our AR Control Center, or the Collections module. And you can set up your collection work list buckets. Now what that means is that if an account is 25 days past due or 60 days past due, you can set up your defaults here. Now you'll watch the collection training video later on, I hope, and in fact when you're going through these system defaults you may not understand some of the things because you're just starting to learn the software. That's okay. We need basically a basis to get off on before we start working in the software and setting up other screens. And don't worry, you can always come back and make changes later on if you'd like. So, for example, if I don't want 25 but I want the typical 30, and instead of 222 I want 120, go ahead and click in here and change that. Now when you change it, you don't want to mess around with the format here. In other words, I don't want to come in here and type in 30 and hit the space bar and go, well, that comma is annoying, so I'll delete it. That's all coding, and if you start messing with that, it's not going to pull correctly. So, for example, I want no spaces. I want to add a comma in between each work list bucket, 30, 60, 90, and then finally 120. When I'm done, be sure to save your work. And you'll notice that after I save my work, over here where it says modified, you can find out who made the change, what day and what time. So if things are going squirrely in your system, you may want to come in here and check and see if anybody's made any changes. So let me emphasize my point here. So we have a collection work list bucket. Now I'm going to go off in another screen here. I don't want you to focus on that. I just want you to focus on the key idea here that we can change system defaults. Master files to AR Control Center over to collection work list. Now you'll notice I didn't close out of system defaults. It actually minimized into the lower left hand corner, so if I need to bring it back I can just click on the button and there it is. So again, I'll leave it open and it'll minimize from master files to AR Control Center to collection work lists. Now again, the whole point of the screen is saying that there's certain fields in certain screens where I'd like the system defaults to pull. And in this case, there's my 30, 60, 90, 120 when I'm setting up my work list for collectors to work on. So let me close out of here. Let me go back to my system defaults and let me change this to 220 or 122. Save. Now if I go back to master files over and down to collection work lists, then when I click on the drop down arrow, there it is. My system default has set that now to 122. So having understand that hopefully a bit more, let's close out and set up the rest of our system defaults. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to change this back to 120 and click Save. Now note that you can come through here and change all your categories and then save them all at once. You don't have to do it field by field or category by category. Next is your default collections filter. All that means is when you enter into the collections module by clicking on that telephone button there, is that how do you want to work your collections? Do you want to do it by collector, responsible party? Do you want to type in a patient's name and pull up their collection account to work on? Or again by work list? And the most popular one is work list. So you want to watch the training video on collections work list, but for right now I'm going to stick with this default. Next, appointments. Allow multiple page groups. Anytime you look at the default value and you can't change it, it's static here, then you'll have to contact Advanced MD support and have them change it. That's on the back end. But for example, allow multiple page groups means that by default, everyone is set to know who gets a new office key, meaning that you only get 100 column calendars to schedule appointments on. Theoretically, you get one calendar for each doctor to schedule his or her appointments. Now, if you need 400 or more, call AdvancedMD support, have them change this no to a yes, and then you get up to 400 column calendars. Charge slip template, superbill or encounter forms. AdvancedMD calls them charge slip templates. And all that means is that by default, when you're printing off your charge slips, or you want to post your charge slip online electronically so you don't have to deal with paper, do you want your standard charge slip to pull? Or do you have other offices, facilities like hospitals, and maybe you want that as your standard to pull? By default, if you go ahead and delete that, leave it blank, then every time you generate a charge slip or you want to print one for a patient, there's a field that you'll have to go in and select which charge slip you want to use. Now, instead of having to type that over and over again in that field that you want to use the standard or whatever charge slip you'd like to use, why not just have it populated automatically for you, especially if more than 50% of the time you're going to be using that charge slip anyways. For example, let's say we have a one doctor office here. He only works out of his office, not at a hospital. Then you'd want to choose the standard. Over to the right here, you can click on this ellipsis button. It's got three little dots. The techie term is ellipsis button. It's also known as the lookup button because when I click on it, it looks up that field to see if there's any data in it. Now, having said that, I would say about 80% of the time when you click on an ellipsis button, it'll pull up the data. If it doesn't, by all means, don't think that there's no data in there. If you really want to know, then come up in the search field, type in the %, and then click search. And it will pull everything that is in that field that's not pulling right then and there. Let me click cancel. I'll type it in here, %. When I type anything in a field that has an ellipsis button, always hit the tab key. I would say you must always hit the tab key because if you don't, it doesn't do a search. If you click out of it, nothing happens. But if you click in here and you type in the % and you hit the tab key, there you go. It searches for everything and pulls up everything that's available in that field. If there's nothing in the field, you'll get a blank screen. But we have two superbills or charge slips. I have one that's hospital and one that's standard. By default, all new Office keys will have standard. You won't have anything else. And you'll want to watch the training video, and you'll see that later on, how to set up your charge slip. Your charge slip standard, you can double click on that and select it here, so anytime you're printing your charge slips or posting charges online, your default standard is going to pull. And that's where the doctor is going to enter in all his procedure codes and diagnosis codes that he wants to check off and choose from. Now, again, you can leave this blank, you can delete it. That just means that you have to do one extra step. You actually have to select it when you're generating charge slips in the other screens. When you want to print them off, you'll have to say, look, I want the standard. In fact, if I delete this and I type in the letter S because I know standard begins with the letter S, and I hit my tab key, remember we're in an ellipsis button field here. If I hit my tab key, it'll do a search for me. If it's there, it pulls it up. If there was more than one charge slip named standard, like standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, it would give me a pop-up memo and say, look, I've got 3 standards here, which one do you want? And you can just double click on the correct one. Next, check for patient consent at check-in. Do you like pop-up boxes or pop-up memos in front of you? Well, when you're scheduling patients and you're checking them in, if they don't have a consent memo on file, you can select yes here, and a pop-up memo will tell the front office saying, look, we don't have a consent memo on file, get the patient to sign one, and then let's scan it in. And once you scan it in the chart files and the patient demographics, you want to go to the Memos tab and put an expiration date on this consent that you scanned in. Because if you don't, every time the patient comes in, you'll keep getting that pop-up memo, even though they already gave you a consent form. Now, you can watch the training video on that. That's not the point here. Just know if you want a pop-up memo as a reminder, and then later on when you watch the training video, you learn how to turn that consent pop-up off for patients who you already have a consent memo for. If you don't like pop-ups, you can leave it as no. Add waitlist hold time if slot opens up. What that means is if a slot opens up, you do a cancel or a no-show on one of the appointments. In its place, it's going to have a waitlist, the word waitlist, and a pretty color, I think it's turquoise or blue-green. Now, you don't have to have that, and you can set this field over here to 0 days. What that means is if you put a day in here, 5 days, for example, we've got 5 days, and let's say Sally had an appointment on May 5th, but she calls in on May 2nd to cancel. Since she canceled within 5 days of her actual appointment, in its place a wait list will automatically populate there. Now, that's just a visual cue for the front office to say, hey, look, we've got a wait list, and in the appointment scheduler, you do have a waiting list. Whether you use it or not, it's up to you. And if you have 20 or 30 people in there, isn't it nice to pull from that wait list instead of taking walk-ins? because that would be rude if you're scheduling patients, your walk-ins, when you have a wait list there. So it's just a visual cue for the front office. Another example here is if Sally instead cancels in April for her May 5th appointment, nothing happens, because remember, what we set here is just within 5 days of the actual appointment if there's a cancel or no-show, and we actually go into the appointment and we cancel it or delete it within 5 days of her appointment.